Welcome back to our lesson in Go programming, web applications. So in this lesson, I want us to look at the idea of middleware. Okay, so in essence, we want to be able to do something to the request before we hand it off to the handler. And so what do I mean by that? Well, let me give you a typical example. Let's say I want to add some information to my response. Okay, so before I send a response to the user, I want to do a bit of pre-processing. Maybe I want to add some security headers to the response. Or maybe for every request that comes in, I want to log that request. I want to know where the IP address is coming from. I want to know what method they're using. For example, I could also want to know how long the request took between the server receiving the request and the server giving a response. So this idea is simply called middleware, whereby we can specify certain actions on the request response cycle. All right, so let's, although I haven't really told you how we create a middleware, let me show you a scenario where we could or we will implement middleware. So let's say I run my server, okay, or my web application. Let's open another terminal, okay, and I want to use the curl command to get the header information from my web application. So in other words, I want to find out what the header is if I were to call the server. Okay, so local host, okay, and port 4000. So what actually gets returned? So this is my request. I want to see the header that is returned to the user. In other words, the W, our response writer. Okay, so notice the header information that is returned to the user's browser is HTTP, okay, the date, the content length, and the content type. So notice there aren't any security headers added. And usually what happens, we need to add security headers because it makes our application a bit more secure. In other words, it gives the client's browser some hints. For example, let's say that some malicious person decided to write JavaScript code, malicious JavaScript code, and put it in a CSS file. Now, as is, the browser, if it's a very aggressive browser, the browser will look and say, oh, even though it's a CSS file, I see JavaScript code in it. So it must be JavaScript. And so I'm going to run it as JavaScript. And so it will run all that malicious code. So you don't want that to happen. So you could tell the browser, okay, you know what? Do not try to guess the type. Okay, do not guess. If it's a .css, make sure you run it as a CSS file. All right, and so that's what I mean by security headers, whereby we give hints to to the browser, and there are quite many. And so let's create a middleware so that before we send this response, okay, so before we send the response, we want to add a couple security headers here so that when all of this goes back to the client's browser will know what to do and what not to do. Okay? All right. So now let's discuss how to create middleware. So again, middleware is just a fancy way of saying we want a piece of code to be applied to the request. It could be to every request. It could be only to requests that go to a certain handler. All right. So let's start off, and we will make a middleware that applies to every single request. So every request that comes to the server, with this middleware, this functionality will be applied to that request. Okay. All right. So let's create a file in our web directory, and we're going to call this file middleware.go. So all our middleware will go into this file, and of course it's a part of main, so package main. Okay, and we're going to import net/http. Okay, so I'm going to give this function a name, and I'm going to call it security headers middleware. Okay, and now this middleware takes something, a variable called next of type HTTP that handler. Okay, and this is a very interesting let me type, and it returns something of that same type called handler. Okay, and so the question is, what exactly is an HTTP.handler? Well, if we come to our documentation, no, handler, yeah, here. It says that handler is an interface, okay? In other words, every handler has a serve HTTP method, and the method has a response writer and a request, a pointer to a request. We've seen these two things before, right, in our handlers. And so a handler responds to an HTTP request. In other words, if something is a handler, if something has a serve HTTP method, that thing can handle a request that comes in from some client. Okay, that's it. That's all there is to know. And so, if you think about it, this middleware will be accepting some handler, meaning something that has a serve HTTP method, and it will also return another thing that also has a serve HTTP method. In other words, it will take in something that can handle user requests, and it will send back something that can also handle user requests. Okay, so let's look at it. And what we're going to do, when the user sends a request to my server, okay, to our Quotebox app, the server, let's say the user wants to create a new quote, okay, /quote, /quote to get the web form. But we will tell the server, we'll say, server, you know what, do not call serve HTTP on my handler. No, don't do that. I want you to call the middleware first. And so the middleware will in turn call the handler. Okay, and so in other words, we get in front of the action, and you could clearly see this when we did this. If you recall, when we were working with our file server, okay, you notice we said we had something called strip prefix, and so even though the user put in a specific path, we stripped it off. And then after we stripped it off, we sent that to the server. So notice we got ahead of the action. We did something before we sent it along. And that's basically what middleware does. So instead of, for example, if I add a middleware, for example, here, let's say I add a middleware whereby the only way you could enter a new quote is if you are signed in. Well, then what I would do is to have a middleware which protects this handler. And so when the user types /quote, the server will not call create quote form, it will call the middleware. And then the middleware will check to see if the user is valid, and then the middleware will call create quote form. Okay? So in other words, it's sort of like a protector in that sense. Okay. So let's create our middleware. So we know that we will accept some handler, something that has a serve HTTP method. Okay. And so we need to return one of those same things. And so we will actually return a function. Okay. And so we will return a function. But let me not put the return yet. Let me create the function. And so I'm going to say down here, I'm going to say func. And this function is going to be anonymous. What does that mean? It means it will not have a name. It will only have the parameters. So w http dot response writer okay, and it will also have my R, a pointer to my HTTP that request. Okay, we've seen this before. We've seen this signature before. Oops, response. Okay, so now, what am I gonna do? Well, I will now set the header, okay, information. So I'm gonna set a header in my response. And so this header, let's call it one x.xss, that protection. Okay, so we're trying to protect sort of cross-scripting attacks. All right, the link I send you will have a list of all the headers and what they try to protect. And so the arguments to this security header will be 1 colon and mode equal block. All right. Okay. Now another security header is called X frame options. Okay, and it prevents another type of common attack. Okay, and so the parameter is to simply say deny. Okay, if the browser sees this type of attack happening or suspect it's trying to happen, the code might cause it, then it simply denies it. Okay, now, so I'm going to call this step sort of pre-processing. Okay, so this is what the middleware will do to the request coming in. It will add this header to it. It will add this header to it. And that's all it does. So now, once the middleware has done its job, what's the next logical thing to do? Well, the next logical thing to do is to then call the original handler, or call whoever was supposed to have been called in the first place. Right? Okay, so like for example, when let's say you have a famous person and a letter gets delivered to them, well, they're not just going to give the famous person the letter, because it could be poison or it could be a bomb. And so they're going to take the letter to a special room and they're going to open it and they're going to do what needs to be done. They're going to check it. And then they're going to deliver it to the person, and then the person can read that letter. Okay, so there's always somebody in the middle, and that's our middleware. That's the reason why it has the name middleware. Okay, so we have done our job, and so now we will take this altered response writer. So remember now, W has been altered. The original W would not have had these two headers. So the server calls the middleware, and so the server will give the middleware the request, and of course it will have the W as well, the response writer. And so we have those two things, and so we can alter W. We can even use R. So after we have done what needs to be done, we will then call the original handler. And so I will simply say next. That's the name, right? This was supposed to be the one that was supposed to be called, but I'm going to call it now. So next dot, and how do I call it? I call it serve HTTP method. And if you recall, it expects the W and it expects the R. Okay, so I'm going to continue the chain. Okay, continue the chain. All right, server calls me. Now I call the handler. And if there are anything that needs to be done after, I'm going to call out post processing. Okay, and so you might be asking, well, if I call the handler, will I ever come back to this middleware? Yes, you have to come back. So the way it works is the server calls me, the middleware, and then I call whatever handler needs to be called. Now, when that handler completes, it will return to whoever called it. And since I called it, well, then here, I could put anything else if I wanted to. In the next lesson, we'll see how that works. For now, we're only going to show pre-processing and continuing the chain. Right? So no post-processing for now. Okay. Okay. So this is just a regular function, believe it. Okay, just a regular function. It's not a handler. It's just a regular function. So the question becomes, well, I'm supposed to send back a handler, but all right. So it says here the handler must have a method called server type, server HTTP. Okay. And so lucky for us, Go gives us a serve HTTP method for free. All we have to do is to tell Go, I want this function to have a serve HTTP method. In other words, I want this function to be a handler, and Go will just give us a serve HTTP. So how do we tell Go that? Well, all we do is to say that this function is an HTTP handler. So we're going to say HTTP dot handler func. Okay. Okay. And so Handler func simply takes a function that has a response and a request, and it creates for us a handler, right? It creates a handler. So the handler func type is an adapter to allow the use of ordinary functions as HTTP handlers. Good. So lucky for us, just by putting our function inside this handler func method, we have a handler. And so since we now have a handler, what do? Well, let's just return it. And there we have it. We have returned a handler. Okay. Now, this is fair enough. And so you may be asking, well, so how do I use this thing now? Okay. Well, as I said, you could have the middleware process every request, or you could have the middleware be selective in the requests that it processes. In this example, we want to process every single request. Okay, so how do I do that? Well, simple enough. All I do is I will tell the server, okay, server, whenever a request comes in, all right, remember if we come back here to main, let's go to main, okay, our server, this field is our MUX, okay? And remember, the MUX is just a router. The MUX stores for each URL, for each path, what is the server? I'm sorry, what is the handler it should call? All right? That's what this field is, all right? And so if you notice in my routes.go, right, we return a MUX, which is simply a mapping from the path to the handler to call. And so under normal circumstances, the server will simply call MUX. And then MUX will go and say, oh, okay, the person wants / quote. What's the handler? Oh, it's this one. Okay, so let me send the R and the W, the request, the response, after the handler. And then the handler will do its thing, which we wrote the code for. Now, let me be a bit more specific. When the server sees the path, yes, it calls MUX. But you know what? If I click on MUX, it says it's of type HTTP that serve MUX, but that's a lie. MUX is actually a handler. Okay, so MUX is actually a handler. Okay, so even though it returns a HTTP that serve MUX, serve MUX is actually a handler. But what does that mean if serve MUX is a handler? It means that serve MUX has a serve HTTP method. So to be more specific, the server calls the MUX HTTP.serve method. Now, what does MUX in turn do? MUX checks to see what is the right mapping and say, oh, okay, quote. And what does MUX do? MUX does not call create quote form. It calls the serve HTTP method on create form. So behind the scenes, like I told you, create quote form is also a handler. And so it also has a serve HTTP method. And you might be saying, well, I didn't create one. Well, you don't have to, right? You don't have to. Once it's a handler, Go automatically adds it in for you. And so it's just a bunch of chain, meaning server calls the MUX's serve HTTP method. the mux then looks for the appropriate entry in the map, and then it calls that handler's serve HTTP method. So all I'm trying to say is all of these things are handlers. Okay, they have type handlers. And so if I come here and I go and say, do I have a serve mux? Serve mux. Do you see here? Serve mux has a method called serve HTTP. And so if you have a method called serve HTTP, it means you are a handler. Okay, good. So we have established that all of these things are handlers. So back to the original problem. I don't want the server to call mux. I want the server to call the middleware. And then the middleware will call mux. And then mux will call the handler. And that's easy enough. All I have to do is to say return security mux. But now I have to change this, right? I will have to say return an HTTP, not handler. And so when I return, I am not going to return mux. I am now going to return security handler middleware mux. What does this mean? Well, if you think about it, when main, right, when we call app.routes, well, obviously we're going to call this here, right? So it will build the mapping tree, right? It build the mapping, right? It build the server, the file server, good. And then it will call security headers middleware, and it will pass it mux. Remember, even though mux is of type http.server mux, it's still a handler because it has a serve HTTP method, as I just showed you. So it's quite an acceptable argument. And so I'm going to take this mux and what I'm going to do with the mux, I will call its serve HTTP method when I am done adding my two headers. So after I've added my two headers, right, I will say, okay, my job is done. So now let me call the thing that was supposed to be called in the first place, which is mux, which we now call next. And then of course, control will go to mux. And then mux will go ahead and call whatever it needs to call. And that is middleware. Now, so again, and by the way, this is the pattern that you follow. Your middleware has to return a handler, because remember, you want to be able to call the serve HTTP method. Okay, so you accept a handler and you return a handler. And so all you do is to create an anonymous function, okay, of the type response writer and request. And then whatever you need to do, you put it inside the function. And then you must call serve mux on next. Okay. And then to make sure that it is a handler, you simply wrap it inside an HTTP that handler func. And so all of this is now a handler. Okay. And that is what you return. And so when it's all said and done, when you go back to route, you're going to return an actual function. So all of this means you're going to return a function. Okay, a function. So now when you type up some path, the server, okay, where is it? The handler will make the call, and the call would then cause the server to call the security header middleware. The security header middleware will add these two headers to W, and then it will call mux, and then mux will go ahead and call whatever of the routes it was supposed to, whichever of the handlers it was supposed to call. Okay, so the process is quite straightforward. Let's see the implication of adding the middleware. So I'm going to come here, new terminal. Okay, and so I'm going to start my server. Oh, it's already in use. Okay, let's close that. Is it this one? Yeah, this one. So Control C. Well, let's start the server again. Remember, previously, this was all the headers that we were getting. The browser, the client's browser, was getting these headers. Nothing about security. So we've added, so basically, before the user gets back the W, the response, we're going to step in front. We're going to take that response. We're going to add the security headers, and then we're going to pass that to mux, and then mux will do what it needs to do, and it will hand it off to the handler, and the handler will do its job by sending back a response with the headers added. Okay, so if I come here, sorry. This was the original headers without the middleware, and so I'm going to call it again. And so what do you notice? The browser now will have these two additional security headers added, which will help the browser to make better security decisions. Okay, and this will happen for every single request. Why for every single request? Because we have put the middleware in front of mux. Okay, which means that for every request that comes in, the server will hand off that request to the middleware, which means that every request will be affected by the middleware. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to end this lesson here. It's quite a lot. The concept is very simple, but I wanted you to see the importance of this new concept. Okay, and of course, middleware is just, think of it as you stepping in front before the final action gets completed. Okay. Okay. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to create another middleware that affects every single request. And this middleware will simply log that request. And it will allow me to show you how we can do post-processing. All right, great. So I'll see you in that next lesson.